What if I told you that one quiet English city helped shape the future of Western civilization? A city where Roman emperors died, where Christianity rose to power, where Viking kings ruled, medieval scholars thrived, and entire ages of history turned, again and again. This city has been burned, besieged, abandoned, rebuilt, and reborn more times than almost anywhere else in Britain. Most people walk through it without realizing what really happened here. This is York, and this is its entire story. Stand on the ancient walls of York today, and you're standing inside nearly 2,000 years of human history. Roman soldiers once kept watch from this very spot, scanning the horizon for enemies at the edge of the known world. Viking traders later walked the same streets tourists crowd today. Medieval monks, Tudor rebels, Georgian crowds, and wartime firefighters all stood here too, often fighting to keep the city alive. Walk through the shambles, and you're following paths first laid out by medieval hands. Touch the stone of York Minster, and you're touching a building that took more than 250 years to complete. Generation after generation working on something they would never live to see finished. York is not a city that quietly passed through history. It's a city that history repeatedly crashed into. Empires rose here. Empires fell here. Plague emptied its streets. Bombs fell from the sky. And through everything, York endured. What you're about to watch isn't a traditional history documentary. Using advanced AI techniques, we've taken centuries-old engravings, damaged paintings, and faded photographs, and brought them back to life. You won't just hear about York's past, you'll see it. This is the entire history of York, 2,000 years, told in 30 minutes, and it begins at the beginning. It's the year 71 AD. Roman legions are pushing north into hostile territory, chasing British tribes who refuse to submit to Roman rule. The land is unfamiliar, dangerous, and fiercely contested. Then the soldiers reach a strategic point where two rivers meet, the Ouse and the Fosse. Here they stop, not to rest, but to stay. The Roman 9th Legion begins building a fortress. At first, it's timber, quick walls, watchtowers, defensive earthworks. Later, stone replaces wood. Permanent buildings rise. Roads are laid out with precision. They name the settlement Eboracum. This is no temporary military camp. This is the foundation of a Roman city at the very edge of empire. 5,000 men make their home here, battle-hardened veterans who have fought across Roman territory. They build bathhouses and barracks, temples and administrative buildings. Merchants follow the soldiers. Civilians settle nearby. York is born as a military stronghold, but it doesn't stay that way for long. Then something happens that still puzzles historians nearly 2,000 years later. Sometime in the early 2nd century, the Roman 9th Legion disappears. 5,000 soldiers, their officers, their standards, their records, gone. No confirmed battlefield, no official explanation, no trace of what happened to them. Did they march north and get wiped out? Were they quietly reassigned to another frontier? Were they destroyed in rebellion and erased from official memory? We may never know. What we do know is that they never returned to York. Another legion, the 6th, takes their place and remains in the city for the next 3 centuries. Under their watch, Eboracum grows in importance. York is no longer just a frontier fortress, it's becoming a center of power. By the early 3rd century, York is important enough that Roman emperors themselves travel here. In 211 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus arrives in York after campaigning in Scotland. He's old, he's exhausted, and he's dying. At the very edge of the Roman Empire, in a city built by soldiers, Severus draws his last breath. His death alone would make York historically significant. But the city isn't finished reshaping the world. Nearly a century later, history bends sharply in York. Another emperor, Constantius, dies here in 306 AD. His army gathers in the city, uncertain of what comes next. Then, in a moment of raw military power, the soldiers make a decision. They proclaim Constantius' son as the new emperor. His name is Constantine. At the time, no one in York could have known what that decision would lead to. Constantine will go on to legalize Christianity, ending centuries of brutal persecution. He will reshape the Roman state, move the capital east, and lay foundations that still influence politics, religion, and culture today. Western civilization pivots on choices made by a man whose reign begins right here in York. Outside York Minster today, a statue quietly marks the spot. Most people pass it without realizing how much history began there. Within decades, Christianity is no longer just tolerated, it's becoming the establishment. By 314 AD, York has a bishop attending church councils on the continent. The city that began as a Roman fortress is now a center of faith as well as imperial authority. But nothing lasts forever. In the early 5th century, Rome begins withdrawing from Britain. Legions leave, administration collapses. The greatest empire the world has ever known slowly crumbles. Roman walls fall into disrepair. Streets vanish beneath mud and new construction. Stone is scavenged for other buildings, but York does not disappear. People remain. The Anglo-Saxons do not conquer an empty ruin. They inherit a living city. Eboracum becomes Eoforwick, later evolving into York. The old Roman structures are repurposed. New buildings rise among the ruins. Life continues, reshaped but unbroken. For 2 centuries, York adapts to a post-Roman world, no longer imperial but still important. Then comes a single moment that changes England forever. It's Easter Day, 627 AD. King Edwin of Northumbria, a pagan warrior who spent his life fighting for power, walks into a small wooden church in York. Inside, he does something extraordinary. He allows himself to be baptized. One man's conversion might not sound like much, but Edwin is a king, and when kings convert, kingdoms follow. Christianity spreads rapidly across Northumbria, and York becomes its epicenter. That small wooden church where Edwin is baptized will, over centuries, grow into York Minster. Faith reshapes the city once again. By the 8th century, York has risen to a position few cities in Europe can match. Its bishop is elevated to archbishop, placing York on equal footing with Canterbury. England now has 2 great Christian centers, and York is one of them. But York's influence isn't just religious. It becomes a center of learning at a time when much of Europe is struggling in the aftermath of Rome's collapse. Scholars copy texts, preserve knowledge, and teach students from across the continent. One of them will carry York's influence far beyond England, helping shape education across an entire empire. This is York's golden age. But across the North Sea, other men are building ships and sharpening weapons. They've heard about England's wealth, about its churches, about its cities, and they are coming. Across the cold waters of the North Sea, longships are being prepared. Their crews are not explorers or traders this time, but warriors. They've heard stories of England's wealth, of gold and churches, of cities rich and poorly defended. They are coming in force. In November of 866 AD, under cover of pre-dawn darkness, Viking longships slip silently up the river Ouse. Hundreds of Danish and Norwegian warriors disembark before the city realizes what's happening. This is the great heathen army, and York never sees it coming. By the end of the day, the Anglo-Saxon defenders are overwhelmed. The city falls quickly and brutally. York is no longer Anglo-Saxon. It belongs to the Vikings. The Vikings rename the city Jórvík. And this is where York's story takes a crucial turn, because this isn't a temporary occupation. This isn't a smash and grab raid. This is colonization. Viking families settle in the city. Craftsmen establish workshops. Merchants create trade routes that link York to Dublin, Scandinavia, and the wider Norse world. Jorvik becomes one of the most important Viking cities anywhere. At its height, the city may be home to 10,000 people. Huge by medieval standards. Coins are minted here, bearing the names of Viking kings most people today have never heard of. The city hums with industry. Metalworkers shape tools and weapons. Jewelers craft intricate designs. Woodcarvers, leatherworkers, and bone workers fill the narrow streets with sound and movement. This isn't a barbarian stronghold. It's a thriving urban center. For centuries, Viking York was known mostly through chronicles and legends. Then, in the 1970s, archaeologists dig into the ground at Coppergate, and the city gives up its secrets. Entire Viking streets are uncovered, preserved by waterlogged soil. Leather scraps from workshops, wooden beams from houses, tools left behind mid-use, even seeds from Viking gardens survive underground for nearly 1,000 years. This is one of the best preserved Viking settlements ever discovered. Jorvik wasn't just important, it was alive. But Viking rule is never peaceful for long. Kings rise and fall with alarming speed. Alliances shift, violence is constant. Power is held by whoever can take it and keep it. The last Viking king of York has a name that tells you everything you need to know. Eric Bloodaxe. That's not a nickname given by enemies, it's a reputation he earned. In 954 AD, Eric is killed in battle. With his death, the Viking kingdom of York collapses. For the first time in nearly a century, York is English again. But peace doesn't last. 100 years later, England reaches a breaking point. In 1066, Norwegian Vikings attempt to reclaim what their ancestors once ruled. King Harold Godwinson marches north and meets them at Stamford Bridge, just outside York. The battle is savage, but decisive. Harold annihilates the Viking army. The Viking age in England is over. Harold celebrates his victory in York. Then messengers arrive. William of Normandy has landed in the south. Harold turns his army around and marches nearly 200 miles in just 4 days. Exhausted, he reaches Hastings and dies there, struck down in battle. William wins, and York is about to learn what Norman rule really means. In 1068, William of Normandy rides into York. He looks at a city that resisted Romans, Vikings, and kings, and issues a single command: build me a castle. The first Norman castle rises quickly, designed to dominate the city and intimidate its people. A garrison is installed to enforce Norman authority. But York has other ideas. In 1069, the city rebels. York's people ally with a Danish invasion force. They storm the castle. Every Norman inside is slaughtered. For a brief, glorious moment, York is free again. William's response is swift and terrifying. William unleashes a campaign of destruction remembered as one of the darkest episodes in English history, the Herring of the North. From York to Durham, villages are burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered, food stores wiped out. The land is deliberately turned into a wasteland. Chroniclers struggle to describe the horror. Thousands starve to death. Some turn to cannibalism just to survive. York is spared complete destruction, but the surrounding countryside is devastated. William rebuilds York Castle. This time, rebellion will not be tolerated. The message is unmistakable. Defy me, and I will erase you. And yet, even after this devastation, York recovers. Trade resumes, markets reopen. The city's strategic location ensures it cannot be ignored. Slowly, painfully, life returns. York Minster begins its transformation from a modest Anglo-Saxon church into a massive Norman cathedral. Stone replaces wood, arches rise, towers grow higher. York regains influence, not through rebellion, but through wealth and power. But the city's growing prosperity doesn't protect everyone. In 1190, anti-Jewish violence sweeps across England as crusading fervor grips the country. In York, the city's Jewish community seeks refuge in Clifford's Tower, the wooden keep of York Castle. For days, a mob surrounds the tower, demanding conversion or death. Inside, families face an impossible choice. On the night of March 16th, many choose to die by their own hands rather than submit. Those who surrender, hoping for mercy, are murdered anyway. Around 150 people die. The exact number is lost to history, but the shame remains. York is wealthy, powerful, and influential, and capable of terrible cruelty. By the early 13th century, York stands at the height of its medieval strength. In 1212, King John grants the city self-governing powers. York can collect its own taxes, administer its own justice, and run its own affairs. In effect, it becomes a semi-independent city-state within England. This isn't generosity, it's business. York has become rich, staggeringly rich from the wool trade. English wool is the finest in Europe, and York is a major center for processing and export. With wealth comes power, and York is now flexing it. In 1298, King Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots, moves the entire English government to York, not just himself, the treasury, the courts, the administrative machinery that runs the kingdom. For 6 years, if you want to do business with the English government, you come to York. Why? Because Edward is obsessed with conquering Scotland, and York is the perfect forward base. For a brief moment, York is effectively the capital of England. The Scots notice. In 1319, Scottish forces raid south and reach York's walls. In the fighting, the city's mayor is killed. This isn't distant warfare, this is war at the gates. Yet York survives, and even thrives. In 1328, King Edward III marries Philippa of Hainault in York Minster, bringing Europe's nobility to the city. York is at the peak of its medieval glory, and then something far darker arrives. In 1349, the Black Death enters York. There is no understanding of disease, no cure, no escape. Plague spreads through cramped streets and crowded houses with terrifying speed. People die at home, in workshops, in the streets. Death carts can't keep up. Somewhere between a third and half of York's population dies within months. Trade collapses, fields go untended. Workshops stand silent. York survives, but it will take decades to recover. And worse is still to come. The 15th century brings political and religious turmoil that cuts deeper than plague. In 1405, Archbishop Richard Scrope publicly calls for rebellion against King Henry IV. He condemns corruption and excessive taxation. Henry responds, with ruthless efficiency. Scrope is arrested, tried, and executed. The execution of an archbishop shocks England. Churchmen are supposed to be untouchable, but the rules are changing. The medieval world is ending, and York is about to be pulled into the bloodiest family conflict in English history. In 1455, England descends into civil war, not against foreign invaders, but against itself. Two branches of the same royal family fight for the throne. Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose. York, symbolized by the white. And the city of York is not just involved. It is the heart of the conflict. Yorkist armies march from these streets. The white rose flies from the walls. When Yorkist kings rule, the city prospers. When Lancastrians win, it suffers. 3 kings from the House of York will sit on England's throne, and the most controversial of them all is yet to come.